one and all, to Impolite Company on the GCPR.live network. And in this show, we defy the old adage and dive headfirst into the conversations you're always told to avoid: religion and politics. I'm your host, Matthew Best, here to guide you through all sorts of things, but here to guide you through thoughtful and spirited discussions on the issues that matter most. On the show, we believe in more than just polite chit chat. We believe in honest dialogue and the power of hearing different perspectives, whether you're tuning in from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, or anywhere around the globe. And we know that we've got folks who listen from Romania and Finland and all sorts of other places. This is your platform to engage, question, and challenge the status quo. You got something on your mind, want to join the conversation, drop us a line at contactimpolitecompany@gmail.com. Those are really helpful. And if you enjoy what we're doing, want to support us, go to buymeacoffee.com/Impolite Company, or you can find that link on my blog, which is pastormatthewbest.com. It's a blog where I write about religion and politics. Or if you want to show some love for Christ Lutheran Church, the church that I am called to serve, we have 3 free health clinics that run a lot on donations. And so you can do that by going to christharrisburg.org/donate. So buckle up. It's time to break through the barriers of politeness and dive deep into issues that shape our world. This is Impolite Company, and I'm thrilled to have you on board. And today, I'm especially pleased to bring the Reverend Carla Christopher to the show. Carla is a rostered leader in the ELCA and UCC because one is not enough. And she serves as the assistant to the bishop in the Lower Susquehanna Synod and Delaware, Maryland Synod, with a focus on racial justice, cultural competency, and trauma-informed care. She's an author, a teacher, a poet, and more. I honestly don't know how she has time to sleep, and I'm honored to call her a friend. And today we're going to talk about creating a space to talk about difficult conversations, and who knows what else we'll talk about. So thanks for coming on the show, Carla.
I am so excited to be here because if we have ever needed to remind people how to talk to each other again, it has turned out to be this season.
Yeah, you think, right? Now, before we get started, I understand that today is a special day for you. Is that correct?
It is indeed.
It is your birthday. And I am honored that you would agree to come on to this show on your birthday. And
yes, indeed, I did.
So happy birthday to you. I feel like I'm getting the gift by you coming on the show. So I owe you a drink and a dessert and all that good stuff. Happy birthday to you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. And you can see that's how we know you were a pastor politician, baby. Smooth as silk, smooth as silk. And I'm still going to take that wine glass and be excited about it.
There we go. Good, good, good. So I wanted to, like I said, I'm really excited to have you on, given your background and what you do with all the different trainings that you do. And like what you just said at the beginning of, if there's ever a time, it's now, right? There's this heavy focus on so many different things and people are going through a lot. So I'm wondering, when you're going around the synod or either of the synods, I know that the churchwide taps into you to travel the different places around the country as well. What are you hearing and encountering these days with people? What are the challenges that people are expressing?
So the challenges that I'm hearing from congregations are, first, that they are scared and in survival mode, which is where a lot of my trauma-informed care work comes in. These congregations have experienced a huge change in the financial security of their members. They have experienced raised costs of basic things like food and medical care and prescription costs, and they're struggling to find affordable housing. So they're wanting to give less. They feel they have less resource to share. They're in this survival protective mode, tunnel vision, And that's all functions of the brain, right? If a woolly mammoth is charging at you, you lose your peripheral vision. This is an actual neurological fact. My first background was that I studied neuroscience at Columbia University. I promise I'm not making this up for the good story of it. But when we're in survival mode, right, that reptile part of the brain in the back takes over to keep us alive in the face of direct threat. So we see what's in front of us, we lose peripheral vision. We become incredibly heightened in our senses. We are able to see in these details, we're able to hear little phrases and catchphrases that are different from what we might have expected. That's great to be protected from the charging woolly mammoth, but it means that you are more likely to laser in on certain phrases and become incredibly reactive to them instead of thinking about those phrases in a larger context. You're going to look at what's in front of you and have a significant response of, I need to act about this thing that I saw, instead of being able to step back and have a larger context, thoughtful response. And the same deal with, if you are feeling threatened, you are ready to fight, or you are ready to run away and avoid dealing with the situation however possible. And there's actually two other responses besides fight and flight when exposed to severe stress: fight, flee, freeze, and fawn. Now, freezing, like if the bear is coming at you, well, maybe it's an animal that doesn't see that well. If I just stop moving, it won't be able to discern my movement. It won't know that I'm there. If I don't act in a way that's threatening, then maybe this thing coming at me, this stressful situation, will just go away because I'm not pushing any boundaries. I'm not triggering it in any way. And then we also have fawn, which is, well, what if I offer this woolly mammoth? What if I offer this charging bear some food? What if I decoy it? And say, here, you don't want me. You want this candy bar from my pocket. You want this bag of berries. And that's what's happening in our congregations. Scared people who have watched the fall of their capital, who have seen their streets occupied, who have recognized that there's a huge challenge economically, who don't know what's going to happen in the election. They're responding to conversations with fight, flight, freeze, or fawn instead of thoughtful perspective and being able to look at the whole forest, not just the tree in front of them. So we're seeing more fights and conflicts.
Yeah.
We're seeing people opting out of being part of volunteering, of being part of political action, or we're seeing people wanting to be active, but doing it in ways that are so aggressive that we are burning bridges across differences. And so a lot of interfaith coalitions and groups that have worked together previously have lost the ability to do so because they can't figure out how to navigate the conversation around, well, these historically Black churches and historically white churches disagree over LGBTQ issues. Well, that's it, the breakdown of dialogue. These Jewish supporting congregations and their Muslim partners, folks who might be more engaged around Palestine, we can't have the conversation, so we're just walking away. Justice ministry in the last decade has never been harder for me.
Yeah.
Or my colleagues. And that's what I'm seeing across the country.
Yeah. It's reminding me of a few things. I just read How to See a Person by David Brooks. And I don't know if you've read what it, and it was a very interesting read. And he's really kind of talking about how exactly what the title is, how to actually see a person. And in there, it's also kind of this confessional that he has of seeing kind of his own biases and being able to see other people through their lenses and see the actual person and see the stories that they have gone through and the experiences and all those type of things. And it was really interesting very vulnerable piece for him. And there's one thing in there too that I thought was very interesting. He talks about there's a another book that he cites called Albion Seed, which talks about portions of the country are so deeply affected by where people came from that settled, that came from different parts of England, and how that culture still has an impact 350 years now. Like you can, like he was talking about different sections of England, and how their cultural impact on different regions still shows up today. And he was giving examples of like the wherever the section of England that came and settled in the Appalachian region, um, the culture both in England and also then in the Appalachian region was more militaristic, more a certain strand of Christianity, those more interested in like honor and those type of things. And so if you take a look at that today, there's a larger percentage of people who join the military are from Appalachia than really any other part of the country, because of like this is a part of it. And I'm first of all, I'm wondering what you think about that, and second of all, how that might have an impact on what you're talking about as well.
I really do think that culture influences your trauma responsive choice,
Yeah.
right? That in the central Pennsylvania region where we're
Right.
primarily working, right, that's a lot of German immigrant
Right.
background there, which really focuses on, even in the face of famine, of struggle, right, hard work, and silently plowing ahead with
Right.
minimal emotion will save us all. It was the credo of my grandfather and my great grandfather, of my
Uh-huh.
grandmother and my great grandmother from my Pennsylvania Dutch side. And even now, with all of the lovely decolonizing work I have done, and the Jewish and indigenous and Black heritage that have been mixed into my line, currently, I still find that German
Mm.
work hard,
Yeah.
keep your eyes on the prize, stay focused, do not ever accept or admit failure,
Yeah.
is something I have to consciously fight. Sometimes you can walk away. Sometimes you can reevaluate. You don't have to place your stake in the land and commit to remain there for 7 generations
Right.
through storm, tornado, drought, and
Right.
wildfire. But that part of me is so ingrained through my family. And so that, especially when stressed, we regress. When
Yeah.
stressed, we regress. So we not only act younger and go to that type of how we dealt with conflict or how we dealt with struggle that we did when we were teenagers or even young children, but also what is the stuff that we were taught before we did our decolonizing work? And
Yeah.
in our congregations, I feel like in this very German area, we have that niceness,
Uh-huh.
that avoidance of conflict. We are not wanting to fight because we are good, wholesome, healthy farmers. We are going to freeze maybe and shut down. We don't want to flee. We're
Mhm.
not running away. We're not leaving our
Right.
land,
Right.
but we will just pretend that the outside world around us is not happening.
Yeah.
We will continue to do what we have always done. It worked for our ancestors. It's having a rough season now, but it will work again. And so the resistance to change, adaptation, a refusal to accept that maybe some things are just gone, or that there may be gifts in doing something differently this time. The more stressed, the less excitement about
Right.
new ways of doing things is what I'm seeing. And that resonates with me. It's been how many hundreds of years since
Right.
these were fresh German colonists? It's been hundreds of years since these were indigenous tribes.
Right.
But that culture is still very much there. And as a Black person, like I still, I know that a lot of my culture as a multicultural Black woman is based on a lack of trust of law enforcement,
Sure.
a lack of trust of government, a lack of trust of institutions. Um, so I'm only going to invest, but so much. That's
Hmm.
why I still work 17 jobs.
Yeah.
I have every reason to believe that I am called by God to
Yeah.
do this work. But I still have to figure out, as the human in me, not the Lutheran in me,
Hmm.
finds a way to function in trust. Because nothing in my biology, nothing in my brain tells me that trusting an institution will bring me safety. And sometimes the trust in God is interfered with by the fact that I have such a lack of trust in institutions. And so Carla, the follower of Jesus, and Carla, the Lutheran, are often in frequent battle.
Yeah. I hear that. That's so very real. I know that I, in a different way, I have those same type of challenges. You know, everybody, I think, especially, I find that true with Gen X and younger, right? I mean,
Yeah.
we're both Gen X, and
Right. All the
so
people that were told that if you go to college
right.
and you work hard, you will have a successful life, you will do
Yep.
better than your parents.
Yep.
And if it's in books, it's true.
Right.
And just trust the authority figures.
Uh
And
huh.
that did not happen for us, but we still were brought up believing it was. Millennials are like, oh, we know that this system has been
Right.
trash. It's been
Right.
trash since we were little, so we're not concerned about it. But
Right.
there's a hurt, an anger, a sense of betrayal
Yeah.
that fuels my Gen X blood to
Right.
pump through its Gen X veins. That's still like, you tricked me. And I struggle with it still.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I want to ask you this question because, as you know, I talk a lot about the need for intentional mourning. And oftentimes I'll talk about this in terms of congregations need to intentionally mourn because as a society, we're terrible at mourning. As a church, we're really good at funerals, but we're terrible at mourning. And I think it crosses over from culture to church to our politics to everything that we are terrible at mourning in some sense because we're so stuck in the short term, which is about survival, as opposed to the long view of things, which would give us an opportunity to mourn. But I'm wondering what that might play into what you're talking about, especially with trauma, and change and all of those things that you've been talking about.
Very much so. One of the backgrounds, one of my many backgrounds, my mother being Jewish, that we have a tradition called sitting Shiva
Mm-hmm.
when someone dies,
Right.
right? And so when there is a transition, there is an intentional grief process.
Right.
And so we don't just get the business done, make sure the funeral is held, make sure
Right.
the paperwork is completed, make sure the resources and assets are distributed so that the business of life can go on. Before any of that occurs, there is an intentional 7 days
Right.
of first community.
Mm-hmm.
You do not do this alone. You can mourn on your own afterwards, but we need community to support us as truth is revealed and as we go through beginning that process of mourning. So we gather with trusted associates, with family, with colleagues, with people that we have shared experiences with. We gather a supportive community together. We practice hospitality. We make sure there's food. We make sure there's comfortable places to sit, an accessible place to be together. And then we story tell. We share the joys, the challenges. We celebrate what was. We don't just focus on the loss. It's also when you talk about, what a jerk someone was, what a terrible
Mm-hmm.
dancer. Remember
Right.
that ridiculous orange suit coat that he dragged out for every family wedding. right? We bring the stories together to give some humanity back to this individual instead of letting them be this great symbol and bringer of grief or an abstract concept. And we let people have the space to be in their emotions, to feel their feels. You can cry, you can rage, you can laugh. You don't have a way that you just have to present. And then at the end of that 7 days, there is a conscious, we held this space, we can revisit it when need be, but now it's time to compartmentalize it, to put it in the box, and to move on to moving forward. So there is something significant to, we are going to grieve, but we're not going to just grieve in pop up pockets. We're going to put an intentional space big enough to get it out. And then we are going to move on with life as a conscious group decision
Yeah.
on how we are going to move forward. And that's when the wishes and the wills and the next decisions are made. And they're again done with that supportive group. There is something about the intentionality of that process, the communal nature of it,
Yeah.
um, that we are missing from congregations. Any change, even good change, involves loss.
Right.
But are we intentionally uplifting and celebrating what was, or just trying to sell people on the change by saying, okay, well, here's all the reasons it's bad? No, let's also say why it was great. And let's
Mhm.
take the time to mourn it. Let's offer appreciation and give certificates and mugs filled with candy to the people who made it happen. Let's be grateful for what was. Let's celebrate. Let's mourn. Let's rage. Let's be angry. Let's do that in supportive community where we're feeding people, we're hugging people, we're in places that feel safe for us to be. And then let's say we're going to do this for a time, and then we are going to set it aside. We are not going to let this go on forever and let it toxify or poison the new action. We're going to set a time that this is when we're going to start the new thing, but we will mourn up until then. And I truly believe if we had an intentional grief process,
Mhm.
that we did not just alone saying grief is okay, but that we held space to grieve together and to
Yeah.
share and tell the stories. There's healing in sharing stories. And
Yeah.
we don't do enough of that, particularly in liturgical denominations where we're more used to being told what to think and
Right.
being told what to say than feeling comfortable sharing our own faith stories and our own experiences.
I think part of some of that goes to it's kind of complicated, but I remember reading Karen Armstrong, and she wrote this book called The Lost Art of Scripture. And
Mm.
it's a little heady. It would have been great in seminary, but I love to read, and I'd love to read difficult stuff. And she makes this argument about Scripture and the purpose of it, why it came about, right? And a lot of it, of course, and it's not just Christian Scripture, but scriptures across cultures and across religions. And she makes this argument that it started off, all of these scriptures start off as verbal stories, and
Yeah.
and it's storytelling is really the idea, and that's important. And and so what happens is she tells us the history of all these different scriptures, and how they came about. And what was interesting is she talks about at the Reformation time, what happens is she describes it in left brain and right brain circumstances. And she says the left brain went into hyperdrive and the right brain dropped off completely. It got subverted out of the way because everybody was so concerned with being right, which is a left brain type of thing, right? I mean, take a look at the history. It's, the people are killing each other because they don't have the right belief about baptism or communion or whatever. Nothing says Christian love
Yeah.
like Christians trying to make sure they're right. And so the left brain side is concreteness, it's right and wrong, it's these divisions, it's all this type of stuff, it's science, it's all this stuff. And the right brain, this is where the mystics kind of fill that void is more abstract. It's relational. It's empathy. It's those type of things. What I hear, and the reason why that reminds me of what you were saying reminds me of that is what I hear you saying is that intentionality of mourning, a specific intentional time of mourning in all of its very forms, um, not only gets us in touch with our right side, but helps us to be human more fully and says that we are emotional and we are intellectual, and there's both of those. And this is it's a part of the healing, is to heal the bridge that our culture has created, to feel this and to think, and all of this together for a period of time. We can remember that we're human as fully as possible, that we're going to have all of this. That's what I'm drawing based off of what you're saying.
Well, that's resonating strongly with me because in the field of trauma-informed care, right, there are actually 6 pillars
Okay.
for what good trauma-informed care or trauma-informed practice includes. One of them is just safety, that
Mm-hmm.
you cannot bring your thoughtful, logical self to a conversation or a dialogue if you don't feel physically and psychologically or emotionally safe.
Yeah.
So in a congregation, that might show up like if you have people with a lot of church trauma, maybe meet in a coffee shop
Yeah.
or meet someplace with comfortable chairs. That's where accessibility for people living with disabilities becomes important. If you are not feeling safe or feeling so out of your element that you feel threatened and on guard, you're not going to be able to engage in any kind of really helpful, spiritual, thoughtful, creative discussion. And trustworthiness and transparency is one of the other pillars, and that really plays into safety. You cannot feel safe if you do not trust and believe
Right.
that what is being said to you, even if you disagree, it's at least genuinely meant by the person that you are interacting with. And the idea of having empowerment, voice, and choice. That empowerment is another principle of trauma informed care. If you sit down at a table that you cannot get up and walk away from, that's not safe.
Right.
That's going to bring the trauma triggers out and shut down a lot of the best parts of your brain. And if you don't have the ability to actually contribute to this conversation and be part of this work and have your voice really matter and make a difference, if you're being given the chance to talk, but the decision's already been made, what's the right answer has already been determined,
Yeah.
that's traumatic and harmful too. And the other pillars are peer support, and collaboration and mutuality, which really plays into that empowerment, voice, and choice, that there needs to be a willingness to learn from and work together with those that are in the group in the space, and recognizing that culture and history and gender and identity issues do affect people's perception and experience. And so
Sure.
we cannot go into a space where we're trying to have healthy, helpful dialogue if we don't recognize that we don't all have the same understandings, cultural references, the same history. And another part of how that ties in with what you were just saying is I'm thinking about the time that most of our current American Christian denominations came to be,
Yeah.
which was around that the age of reasoning
Yeah.
and this fascination with, ooh, the printing press.
Yeah.
Ooh, we can shift from telling stories to putting it in books and codifying it and saying that it's unchanging and that it
Yep.
is absolutely true. And the people who have access to these books and printing presses are folks that have more wealth,
Yep.
and a specific type of education and a specific type of social connection. So we are disproportionately getting rid of marginalized people's voices, of poor people's voices, of disabled people's voices, of women's voices,
Right.
because by law, who had access to the resources that were able to put the books together. And then we have the debates between, well, this book says this and this book
Right.
says that. So now we have the Lutherans at the very beginning of that, but then a few disagreements on the specific book facts, regardless of the heart or the emotion of the matter. We now start seeing all these other denominations splintering off over these interpretations. And it wasn't just a movement in the church, it was an
Right.
echo of the movement. This was happening in academia, it was
Right.
happening in the scientific world, the categorization and the obsessive naming of animals and trees and plants, of this is a real animal and this one's not, this is its Latin name and this one doesn't count.
The
This obsession.
categorization of human beings,
Right. The
right?
invention of race, the
Right.
literal
It's
invention
all
of
at that same
race
time.
came
Yeah.
out of this same time. And I actually had a marginalized leader, was an undocumented immigrant who ended up becoming a rostered leader in the ELCA. And he said, we are still in a season of worshiping educational fact
Oh, absolutely.
within the church. We have not yet reclaimed the mysticism of the early church, the focus
Right.
on relationship in the early church, the focus on mutual care. I mean, if you look at the Church of Jesus, let me not say church, the ministry, the fellowship
Uh-huh.
that surrounded the ministry of Jesus was safe, was
Yep.
trustworthy, was transparent, was filled and defined by peer support, mutual aid, collaboration, was very much about empowerment and the sense of choice. And the only choice you had to make was to follow or not follow. And even
Yep.
in the epistles, how much conversation of, you know, right or wrong really has more to do with the maturity of
Right.
the person who is learning this as they decolonize and deconstruct their law
Sure.
and rule based faith. But really, it's about how the Spirit moves in you and how the Lord
Right.
speaks to you.
Right.
And that culture and gender and these historical issues were being deconstructed and saying, no, that this community is for all of us, regardless of what tribe we're born into and what land we're into or what marital status or health issue or gender issue. The kingdom of Jesus was trauma informed.
Right.
The kingdom of the age of reason church was much more focused on being defined by intellect and the rule, not even the rule of law, but the rule of the written word, the rule of academic intellectuality. And so in this time now in 2024, when it's not privileged people in church who are operating in their intellectual brain and the side of the brain that functions on all these lovely facts, we're now experiencing trauma. It's COVID, it's politics, it's, George Floyd, and it's tanks in our streets. And so now we are in the emotion part of our brain. We're in the fear part of our brain. We're in that place where the functions of our intellect are not at their full force.
Right.
And we don't have a church equipped to meet people where they are with their current level of brain function, spiritual function, emotional function.
Yeah, that there that let's see if I can remember like it that what you were just talking about sprung three things and I don't remember that I'm gonna if I got those down. But one of the other things that the early church was very intentional about mourning, right? I think about the story of the death of Lazarus, and Jesus comes, and Mary and Martha are sitting Shiva during that time. They're in the fourth day of it, right? I mean, it's very clear that story, and they're literally sitting together in their home, which is exactly where in that this is exactly what you do. The odd thing about that story is they leave to go to Jesus. They
Mm-hmm.
leave. They're not supposed to leave from that, right? It's just a fascinating story. But Jesus is also coming, and he mourns with them uh in that story, right? That's where we get the shortest
That's right.
verse. Jesus wept, which I always tell people, look, like he knew what he was going to do, and yet he wept, because resurrection is not a rewind, right? It's there's still life, death, and resurrection, and Lazarus went through all of that. And resurrection, death is saying what was is no longer. It's coming to terms with that reality of the present. And then resurrection is a new possibility, a new way of going forward, but it doesn't negate what just happened in death. I mean, if you know the story, because what happens later is then there's like, the church authorities are like, well, we can't have a resurrected guy walking around anymore. Now we got to plot to kill him so he can die a second time,
Yep.
because that creates problems. Resurrection creates problems for the status quo and keeping things the way they are, and all that type of stuff. Anyway, so I wanted to add in the morning part about that, and I forgot what the other two things are, but that's all right. It just
Well, you
happens,
know what
right?
that made me think of
Yeah,
is the Triduum,
yeah,
right? We we celebrate the resurrection.
right.
We lift up, yay, this
Yep,
wonderful thing has happened. And we don't spend a lot of time naming that a hugely traumatic event
yep,
happened to Jesus' mother, to Jesus' friends. The
yep,
apostles saw this arrest, this imprisonment, this false trial, this really long, brutal, painful,
yep,
bloody death of their dear friend, and then actively grieved for 3 days
right.
before a resurrection they didn't fully expect or have any idea how to handle ended up happening. I can't
Yeah,
even imagine going through the deaths I've gone through with
right,
friends and family members and having them pop back up 3 days later.
right.
But especially after the way that Jesus died, it would wreck my whole psychological reality
Oh,
to
absolutely.
have to process that. And I think in the earlier iterations of church, before this worship of reason
Yeah,
and education, and before this cultural, let's not deal with the emotional
yep,
aspect
yep,
of grief, let's deal with um, what's the action, what's going to get it done, right? Even in our early Catholic days, but certainly with the early church before this codification of religion,
yeah,
we had Lent of just grief, of
yep,
fasting and
yep,
deep mourning. And then we had a 3 day service of just dwelling in the struggle.
yep.
We walked the stations of the cross.
Mm-hmm.
We spent this time journeying with the suffering and naming the grief and naming the struggle that people of faith are called to go through before a resurrection can come.
Yeah,
And then we get to celebrate Easter. And it doesn't just make the resurrection that much more of a celebration. There is a strength and a resilience that is cultivated in that. There's a building of community when you go through something so intense in community together.
yep,
And then over time, as we've seen, people still all show up on Easter,
yep. Oh, yeah,
but we've seen attendance at Triduum celebrations. We've seen the practice of doing the Stations of the Cross in a group. We've seen the disciplines of Lent really drop in popularity.
yep,
And I think a lot of that has to do with that culturally.
yeah,
We don't talk about tough emotional stuff. We don't deal with grief. So is it that people are just less interested in church? Or is it that increasingly, as a society, we do not have the tools to
mm-hmm.
process that level of grief? We don't know how to be in community with each other and support each other through the remembrance of mourning. We just want to pretend that doesn't exist. We either want to freeze and shut it down. We want to turn it into something cute and nice
Mm-hmm.
and which is fawning. We want to flee from it and avoid it and not deal with it at all, right? Or we want to fight and say, I don't agree with this. I think this is a horrible practice. It makes me angry, so I'm just not going to engage in it. That's a trauma response to that
Right.
grief.
Right.
And then we want to jump straight to the resurrection. But then the resurrection becomes an intellectual exercise,
Yep.
not an emotional one, because we're dealing with it with our heads, because we
Yep.
couldn't handle dealing with it with our hearts, because that would have involved the grief part as well as the celebration part. You cannot feel the celebration
Yep.
if you can't also feel the grief. Emotions are not a light switch you can turn off and on.
You just preached a beautiful Easter sermon. I'm just going to tell you. I hope again we're recording this, so you'll be able to keep that in case you forget how you did it. But that was absolutely beautiful, and it reminds me too of in our Lutheran tradition we do typically a confession and forgiveness at the beginning, and I have talked about the idea of how
Mm.
very important that is because in a sense it's a little bit like life, death, and resurrection, and it's this we have to feel all of the stuff that has broken relationship with others and with God and with ourselves and with the rest of creation, and then we can actually hear, hey, by the way, all that stuff, God's forgiving you and God is taking it away. Wow, what a difference. Like you can actually then like appreciate in one sense of what's happening, and then it opens you up to hear the word. It opens you up to be in communion with others, to receive, and then to be
Mm.
sent out and all that type of stuff. Anyway, I wanted because we're getting close on time already, which I can't believe.
Right.
I also wanted to talk a little bit about you do a lot of work with justice work, and I know that is a word oftentimes that some people are going to struggle with, and when they hear it, sometimes it's just going to be for some people a loaded word, like, oh, that just means this, right? And and so because we're talking about religion and politics, I'm wondering with you know I think all the stuff that you're talking about not only applies to congregations and church and theology and what people are experiencing, but also our political landscape as well. And
Mm-hmm.
especially, our systems that exist in the world, whether they're just or unjust or some variation of the two. Um, I, I want to get into the idea of how can people really kind of engage in moving us in a direction of a more just society, whether we're talking about that in if people have a political vision of that or a theological or a combination of the two or whatever the case may be. I know that's like a nice simple question.
Ah! So the idea that empathy, putting yourself in the perspective of another person, the ability to just recognize another human's experiences as valid
Yeah.
and real to them, even if they are different from your own experiences. I have encountered the belief that empathy is innate, that we all have it. It's just common sense. That biologically is not actually true.
Mm-hmm.
Infants and young children
Right.
are self centered. They are self centered because of lots of complicated brain development reasons. And the realization that just because you can't see something, it still exists. That's called object permanence. And it
Right.
does not develop until later in life, right? Empathy is something that we learn,
Yeah.
and it is also something that can be taught.
Mm-hmm.
So, a big part of where I think we need to go in terms of society is about relearning
Mm.
empathy
Okay.
and that we need to have intentional ways of teaching empathy. As our educational systems have become so focused on academics instead of being spaces of social development,
Yeah.
manners, working together in society and social situations, and more teaching to tests and getting specific results. We have fewer and fewer spaces where we're actually learning essential social skills and
Hmm.
having them reinforced. The same thing is happening in home situations where in previous economic iterations of America, there might have been more availability of extended family members, even parents that were just around more. But now the vast majority of two-parent families, both parents have to work to survive.
Right.
And so we have kids in large groups, in childcare, in activities where they're being coached toward producing certain skills
Right.
and learning particular things that are not tailored or individualized to them more than essential because they have a real goal going in, because that's needed to get them the scholarships that will pay for their schooling, for their advancement. So, in short, capitalism ruined empathy. The motivation of how our whole social structure has changed, the length of our work days and our work weeks, the ways that our schools work, the ways that our social systems work, the ways that even after work we are out golfing or hanging out places that we can make social connections, that we have to move more often to follow work, right? That's a big part of what
Right.
has separated historically Black and Brown communities and immigrant communities, is that we don't have the chance for families to stay together, extended family networks, or to build up multi-generational communities because we have to go where the work is. And if too much success was built up in one area, those communities were intentionally destroyed, dismantled, police infested. There were just lots of ways that minority communities or traditionally marginalized communities were undermined at having the chance to really build up that emotional support environment. So, politically speaking, we have folks making decisions more influenced by capitalism
Hmm.
than by the reality, the realization that it's real people being affected by this.
Yeah.
So until we start changing our ideas around money and recognizing that mission is more important than sustainability, until we start practicing the same principles of trauma informed care, creating safe environments to have the political discussions, um, and actually having conversations where people feel safe enough to take the step back and we story share. So I'm a big fan, practically speaking, don't just have the conversation about immigration, bring in people that work with immigrants, bring
Yeah.
in actual immigrant humans, take immersion trips and travel. How I felt about immigration changed completely when I went to the borderlands and I was ready to have 6 people carry me out after 3 hours in that desert.
Right.
And so at that day, in that moment, I said, anybody who is willing to cross this 40 miles on foot is leaving something beyond what I can imagine and cherishes what they can get to on the other side, because I couldn't take it. And I'm a pretty hardcore warrior woman. After 30 minutes, I was ready to weep and
Yeah.
just be like, please, Jesus, make it stop. So that real life experience, the placing yourself in another person's position and making sure that we're uplifting voices, resources, the books that we're reading in our book studies, the speakers that are coming into our spaces, What church do you go to? Who is it predominantly filled with on Sundays? Go to a church where people don't look like you, even for a visit. Community fairs and festivals, restaurants, small
Right.
restaurants. Get in the lives, not even just the politics part yet. Just get
Right.
in the lives of people different from you. Develop some real relationships, some actual friendships, do some shared storytelling, and then make decisions and have conversations that are involving people who are real to you. And I have seen it happen. I've seen people's entire lifelong held perspectives change. And this is a fun, as a diversity, equity, and inclusion trainer, fun
Yeah.
fact
Yeah.
that DEI training, when it is mandatory
Yeah.
and when it is essentially to check a box, it's as much as 90% ineffective in
Sure.
changing people's ratings on bias scales and that
Sure.
kind of thing.
Sure.
Having one significant relationship
Yep.
with someone from another category, so to speak,
Yeah.
is as much as 90% effective
Yep.
in changing the level of bias. So if
Yep.
you take a Harvard bias test and you're, for 40 or 50% of your beliefs about this community group come from television and media, you have one friend in that group,
Yep.
and you will now drop anywhere from 50 to 90% in terms of the assumptions you make about them, because now this group of people is not an abstract.
There you
It's
go.
the group that your friends belong to. So
Yep.
that's the change politically, is the building of relationship and the engagement in community intentionally with people different than our own social demographics and
Yeah.
economic demographics.
There's a lot there, and I mean,
Okay, 7 minutes, make it
yeah, I know,
happen.
right? We got, but I wanted to mention, like, this is something that I'm pretty sure we've talked about this before. The idea of when people talk about wanting to debate things, I'll often say, forget about debating the issue, because we're all going to end up going to our tweets, our bumper sticker logic, and all this type of stuff, and it ends up being who has the best one liner. This is why I really don't like to watch debates on television,
Amen.
because they're not really debates. They're just who can get the best zinger in, and have it retweeted, that type of thing. But instead, when we move an issue from the abstract to human beings, that's when things change. I mean, that's the reason why, I came up with the idea for American Roulette, is to tell the story of people who are impacted by a mass shooting. And these are fictional people, but they come to life, and it allows people to talk about a really difficult topic. Because as you were saying, like, we don't offer any solutions in that book. I just want people to see the humanity of of the humanity of the victims, the humanity of the perpetrator, the humanity of the community. That's when we can actually then address some type of things. I want to ask you one last question before we go. So, as a pastor, when people say to you, or they complain, because I'm sure this has maybe happened once or twice, I don't know, maybe it's happened once or twice to me, complain that, Pastor, you're just being too political. What do you say to that?
I pull out my bumper sticker and button debate lines. Um, what I have, the first litmus test is this person approaching me because they want the conversation,
Yeah.
or are they not in a listening space? They're in a shaming space. They're in a, I
Right.
want to um, shake my finger at you. I want to put you in your place.
Yeah.
One of my big changes in recent years is that if someone is not interested in a conversation, it is not my job to try to get them to be interested. There
Yep.
are enough people that are hungry for truth, for gospel, for relationship, for companionship. So if it really is clear that this person's looking for a fight or an
Yeah.
argument, then I will just say to them, I'm sorry you feel that way. I'm being as faithful as I know how. If you'd like to have a deeper conversation, make a make a appointment with me and let's have coffee and talk about it.
Yeah.
Um, but I won't do it in the moment. And if there is someone that really is curious, then I will say Jesus is present
Yeah.
in our everyday life. The Spirit is moving in our everyday life. And our everyday call is to care for God's people and our neighbor, which is every one of us. So if there are ways that our neighbors, that God's people are suffering or struggling disproportionately, my Christian call is to speak up, to hold those systems that are causing that inequity accountable, and to do what I can to make change, not just to give out the food myself or to give out the blankets myself, but to also say, why are there people without food when all food comes from God and all these people are God's? Why are there people with no homes? Why are there people who can't afford childcare, who don't have medical care, when every one of these bodies comes from God? This is Jesus' work
Yeah.
administered through a political system. But we cannot pretend that real people aren't experiencing real hurt or harm when politics aren't tending to their needs. And so, as long as I want to love my neighbor, I'm going to have to stay involved in the systems that are called to care for those neighbors.
Yeah. And that well said. Well said. Great way to end the show. And so, Carla Christopher, Pastor Carla Christopher, thank you so much for spending an hour of your birthday with me talking about talking about these really important. This is not usual birthday conversation, I'm sure. When you're sitting around and making wishes to have a more just world for when you're blowing out the candles on the birthday cake. But thank you so much for coming on. This has been a great conversation. I appreciate it.
I love what you are doing in holding this space, and there's no place that I would rather be. And there is nothing I want more for my birthday than a world that's even a percentage point, a fraction of a percentage point more just. So
Oh, that's
if you're
beautiful.
listening to us today, thanks for being here. And if we all do our fraction of a percent, I
There we
believe that we
go.
can make positive change.
Good. Well, thank you again. And next time, my next guest, you're gonna love this, Carla. My next guest for a couple weeks from now is the Reverend George Scott, who we both know,
Oh,
a colleague of both of ours. He's the pastor of Trinity Lutheran Church in Lemoyne, Pennsylvania, and he's also a former congressional candidate. And so we're going to be talking about being a pastor and running for office and all of the complications and all the wonderful things about that. I'm really excited then also to have George on and to have that conversation. Impolite Company. We're gonna dive into all that good stuff. So with that, thanks everyone. Again, we're part of the GCPR.live network, and if you want to support the show, buymeacoffee.com /impolite company. With that, I will see you later.